now we're going to take a look at reflexes. And reflexes are kind of set responses that are, are needed so often or needed to be completed quickly that they're pre-programmed. Like you don't have to think about them much, okay? Now, in your slides for this week, in the slide presentation, there's a nice video going over all of the pieces of a reflex arc. But just to remind you quickly, in a reflex arc, we receive a stimulus at at a receptor, rather, okay, and it's going to activate a sensory neuron. And it's going to bring that information in to the central nervous system on that posterior root, okay, through that posterior root ganglion into the posterior side of the spinal cord. And from there, we're going to have some kind of information processing of the central nervous system. Some reflexes will send an interneuron and send a message up to the brain. And some of them are so basic and rudimentary that they're like, the brain's like, I don't want to hear about it. Just do it. Just do this response. So it will automatically do a certain response. And then we're going to send the response out by activating a motor neuron that's going to come to some kind of peripheral effector like a skeletal muscle. We can classify reflexes 4 ways, based on development, the nature of the response, the complexity of the circuit, or the processing site. So in development, they can either be innate reflexes, meaning that they were formed before birth, or they can be acquired reflexes, meaning that they are learned. Okay, and repetition, practice makes perfect of those. Okay, so an example of an innate reflex would be the suckling reflex by a newborn. Okay, they automatically know how to latch on and suck on a nipple. We can classify them based on the nature of their response. Okay, they could be either somatic or visceral. Now, somatic reflexes involve the involuntary control of skeletal muscle. If you've had the knee jerk, right? The doctor hits your knee with a little hammer and you kick your foot. Okay, that's a skeletal muscle which normally is under voluntary control, but this reflex is an involuntary response to a certain stimulus. And these are important because of emergencies, because you know, we don't want to always have to check with the brain. Okay? An example would be putting your hand on a hot pan or something, and we don't want to have to check with the brain and go, hey, you want to move your hand now? It's kind of hot down here. You just automatically do it, right? Visceral reflexes, or they can be called autonomic reflexes, control involuntary effectors like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, okay? That might be when you are in danger and your heart rate kicks up and just starts beating faster and harder, okay? That's an involuntary reflex of a visceral reflex. All right, we can classify them based on the complexity of the circuit. Now we have a monosynaptic or a polysynaptic. A monosynaptic is the simplest, fastest of the reflex arcs. It is basically a sensory neuron coming into the spinal cord and synapsing directly on the motor neuron and taking the message back out. We don't check with the brain at all, okay? And these are simple reflexes and they're very fast this way. Polysynaptic reflexes means there's at least one interneuron involved, okay? Maybe more. Maybe we have to cross across the spinal cord and, and synapse on other motor neurons and such. And the more synapses that we have, remember there is a delay, and it was a short delay, but the more we have, they all kind of add up, and so these are slower. And then we can classify them based on their processing site. Okay? We have spinal reflexes, which means that it doesn't even check with the brain. Okay? And then we have cranial reflexes where the brain actually sends the response back down and to what effectors we need. All right. So next, let's take a look at one of the reflex is called stretch reflex, and it's the one that we know the best. It's a monosynaptic reflex. It's very fast. Like I said, it's that knee-jerk reflex is a good example of it. Sensory neuron synapses directly on that effector motor neuron. So here's the patellar reflex. We have the hammer to the knee. It stretches the ligament and the fibers in the quadriceps femoris muscle. And that distortion of those stretch receptors stimulates those sensory neurons, and the sensory neurons are going to come into the spinal cord and synapse directly on a motor neuron at that very same level of the spinal cord. And information processing in the central nervous system occurs at the cell body of the motor neuron. No interneurons needed. We are not even checking with the brain on this one. The brain is like, don't even bother me, okay? And so now the motor neuron is going to be activated, and the motor neuron sends the action potential to the effector, which is also the quadriceps femoris, same muscle, with stimulus and effector were the same muscle, okay? And now we're going to have the contraction of the quadriceps femoris, and that's going to, kick your knee out a little bit. So the receptor in here is a special receptor called a muscle spindle, okay? And these are monitor the amount of stretch in muscle cells, okay? And they wrap around, and don't worry about this gamma motor neuron stuff, okay? But basically, here the fibers are wrapping around specific fibers within the muscle cell, and they're monitoring that degree of overlap and amount of stretch just to keep that the thin and thick filaments moderately stretched, and if they sense being overstretched, the muscle is going to respond by increasing tension. And this goes into just a little bit about how the neuron, the action potential changes. Here you can see in the top illustration that the moderate stretched, we're going to keep a certain amount of muscle tone. When it's stretched, the action potential frequency increases to the brain. And then when the muscle is unstretched, okay, the signals are sent less frequently, which means that we are changing the frequency of the impulses that go to the brain in order to send a message to the brain. Pardon me, I didn't want to cough in your ear. All right, postural reflexes. These are a kind of stretch reflex. These happen all the time. These can help keep you in an upright position. These are muscle groups working, against each other, basically in opposition in order to keep you balanced. If you start to lean forward on your toes, automatically your calf muscles are going to tighten up in order to keep you from falling forward, okay? Withdrawal reflexes. They move you away from a stimulus. So when you put your hand on that hot pan, it's going to move you away involuntarily very quickly. Let's take a look at one of those. So here you got your painful stimulus. We've got the sensory neuron picking that up. Ow, hot, brings it right in to the central nervous system, to the spinal cord. And in this case, we do have interneurons involved because they're going to send messages to the brain saying, well, hey, you might want to yell ow about right now, okay? But we're also going to, one of those interneurons is going to synapse right on a motor neuron. So it's kind of like letting the brain know what's going on down here, but we're not going to wait for the brain to send the signal back down. We're just going to synapse on the motor neuron, and we're going to we got to do a couple of things here first, okay? Well, we were reaching out for the pan, so we were using the extensor muscles, okay? We were stimulating the extensor muscles. So first thing we got to do is we got to quit reaching. So we have to inhibit the extensor muscles. We have to stop that reach. And then we have to stimulate the flexor muscles to pull your hand away. Okay, so that is a polysynaptic reflex because we have multiple synapses involved here. A little more complicated one, okay, and of course a little slower one because the more synapses we need, the slower this is the crossed extensor reflex. In this case, you have stepped on a tack or a piece of glass, and that sensory neuron comes in. It is going to communicate with an interneuron. And we got to do a couple things here. So we're going to have to share this message with a few interneurons, and we're going to have to cross to the other side of the spinal cord because we've got to work on muscles on the other side. So what we got to do, well, again, we were using some extensors as we step down. We have to inhibit those extensors, okay? And we have to now contract the flexors to pull your foot back off of it. On the other hand, you can't fly, so we have to now reverse the other leg because you were walking along, and now we have to have the extensors stimulated to extend that foot down so we can shift our weight and inhibit the flexors that were mid-step before. Okay, so it gets more complicated. Just understand that this is a crossed extensor reflex, more synapses, a polysynaptic reflex. It is slower. All right, let's take a look at some reflexes that are commonly tested. The biceps reflex, tricep reflex, ankle jerk reflex, they're all stretch reflexes, but basically they're studying different segments of the spinal cord along the way. So the doctor can realize and say, okay, well, they're okay at the biceps and they're okay at the triceps, but then we don't have an ankle jerk. So there's a problem in the spinal cord somewhere between these areas. Another reflex assessment is called the Babinski reflex, okay? And this is done on newborns and infants, and basically the doctor takes the other side of that hammer tool and strokes up the foot. And in a normal infant, okay, their toes will splay out, okay? And it's due to a lack of inhibition of descending motor fibers, okay? And it's just a lack of maturity of the nervous system. Their nervous systems are still developing. They're brand new babies, okay? Their brains are still developing. And the splayed toes is normal in infants. In adults, it is not normal, okay? Because their nervous system should have developed to the point where now stroking the bottom of the foot like that, you should get something called the plantar reflex. So Babinski reflex or Babinski sign is the splaying of the toes and in response to stroking of the foot. It's normal in infants, abnormal in adults. Adults should have their toes curl under, a plantar reflex, because their central nervous system has matured. If adults splay their toes out, it means that there has been damage to the central nervous system, perhaps by injury, stroke, or by some degenerative neural disease. Abdominal reflex, stroking the skin, will contract the abdominal muscles, okay, and it moves the navel towards the stimulus, kind of crinkles up your muscles, and absence of this would indicate damage to descending tracts in the spinal cord. So those are some common reflexes.